Let's start with the title of the book, How to Save the Internet. And Nick, what do you think we are saving the internet from?
From fragmentation, in a nutshell. So, there's lots of things one can say about the internet. There's lots of things one can say about generative AI, and indeed I say quite a lot of those things in the book. But the central sort of story of the book is really is generated by the collision of two very, very powerful forces that are shaping our world. One is the globalization of technology. Technology and generative AI is, of course, just the most recent, if dramatic, manifestation of that. Eliminates geography, it eliminates distance, it eliminates borders, and that is colliding with something that's been brewing now for quite some time and is accelerating, which is the deglobalization of politics, as perhaps as almost in response to it. So that's an interesting debate. But whether it's Modi's Hindu nationalism, whether it's Brexit, whether it's Trump, whether it's Erdogan, whether it's Le Pen, whether it's we're living in a world where technology smashes through sort of space, and yet politics is all about pulling up the drawbridge. And I think those things are increasingly colliding. They come on the back of something which I think is often underappreciated, which is that the global internet that people talk about doesn't exist. It just doesn't exist. There isn't a global internet. There's a Chinese internet, there's a non-Chinese internet, and within the non-Chinese internet, you have an increasing pattern of sort of balkanized internets, Russia, obviously, Vietnam. I suspect all of the people who have lined up on the podium with Xi Jinping today will be actively thinking, if they haven't done so already, how they can emulate the Chinese example, which, let's remember, has been devastatingly successful. You may remember the time when, it's a bit of a tangent, but it's an important one, when I think it was Bill Clinton had this wonderful phrase about the early construction of the Chinese sort of walled off internet, and he said you can't, it's like trying to nail Jello to a wall. You can't do it. Data is too well, they did it. They've walled off their whole country and created an incredibly successful and, of course, internally heavily surveilled internet state. My experience in Silicon Valley was that one of the untold stories, because there are lots of controversies which, of course, always flare up in Silicon Valley, but one of the untold stories which I wanted to tell was that actually, in a sort of almost creeping fashion, this incremental fragmentation, balkanization of the internet is accelerating at pace. Governments are passing different rules and regulations which differ from each other. There have been attempts to basically stop the flow of data, which is the oxygen of the internet, flowing from one hemisphere to another. And so this really was an attempt to describe that. What does that mean at a time when the whole of the tech industry is obviously undergoing complete transformation with the advent of generative AI and these powerful LLMs, and what we could do about it. And then the final bit of the book, it makes a wholly unfashionable, but in my view, eventually, I hope, prescient plea for a new deal between the sort of major techno-democracies of the world, India, Europe, and America, to set new rules of the road to guarantee openness, guarantee open data flows, share basic information about the infrastructure of how you create these and train these great big models in the first place. Because I think without that, I don't discount the idea that we could, I don't know, I can't put a figure on it, in 7-10 years' time, look back and say, do you remember that time when we could just effortlessly and for free send stuff from one part of the world to the other, and we lived in this kind of global marketplace of ideas and content, for good and for bad, and now we're all kind of slightly locked in, into our own sort of digital spheres. I think that's a very real risk if we carry on without active leadership from the politicians, which clearly is lacking at the moment. It's not going to happen under Trump. He's in fact. I'll stop now. I know this is a long answer, but I hope it gives you the summary of it. But the fact that you've got Modi in Beijing today, chased really by Trump's ineptitude into the hands of America's main geostrategic rival, China, just shows how awry things are going at the moment. So my plea is I'm not pretending it's going to be taken up anytime soon, but I think with time, the risk, particularly to American interests, of this complete fragmentation of in effect, American-invented internet will drive American decision makers to seek to take up leadership again?
Well, look, we'll test a little bit of those arguments as we continue our conversation. About an hour in, 50 minutes in, I'm going to start going to questions from you. You've seen the QR code, which was up a little earlier. Do plug into that. You can then ask questions, and the people who are watching this on the live stream can also ask questions. They'll come up on my iPad here, the only piece of technology I'm going to be using today. So do think about that whilst we're chatting. But Nick, the reason this book is important is because of the bubbles you have lived in. Brussels and regulation, the European Parliament, and trying to look at multi-state approaches to issues of the time. Then, of course, politics itself in a senior leadership position. It'd be fascinating to hear how you then dealt with tech issues, which you touch on in your book when you were Deputy Prime Minister. But of course, then regulation, European politics, UK politics in a leadership position, and then working for one of the most significant technology businesses of this century, Meta. And I want to start, it's the title of the Intelligence Squared discussion today, Meta AI and the Battle for Big Tech. I want to start with Meta, because I think it's interesting to hear your experiences, what you learnt there, and you say from Mark Zuckerberg and from others that you learnt a huge amount from your years in that business. Now, I'm going to get a bit Mrs. Merton just to kick us off. What was it about the $100 million package from Meta that first encouraged you to engage with Mark Zuckerberg?
FNAR. Look, you may remember when I announced that I was going to work at Facebook as it was then, I got sort of slightly predictable barrage of criticism. How dare you work for these ghastly... It's a company whose products are used by 4 billion people. It's like you can ignore that, you can pretend you don't want to engage with it, but there's for some reason 4 billion people. I mean, I think today, this very day, it is estimated around 100 billion messages would have been communicated worldwide on WhatsApp. 200 billion, I've seen it reported, I don't know what the latest stats are from within Meta, 200 billion short-form videos have been posted and shared on Instagram and Facebook. The sheer scale of this is of such enormous societal significance. So I was slightly taken aback when they first approached me. I was on holiday with the family in Switzerland, and I remember suddenly getting a call from Sheryl Sandberg. I'd never met Sheryl Sandberg before, never spoken to her. She said, "Do you want to come and work in California for Facebook?" I said, "No, of course I don't want to work in California for Facebook." And Miriam and I talked about it. Said, "No, we're not going to up sticks and go to California." This she took, I think, as a personal challenge to persuade me, and then we had lots of back and forth. I went to California.
Why did they want you, Nick?
Well, this is what I was going to come to. I think what they felt at the time, and that's what I subsequently discovered when I went to California, spent a lot of time with Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg, was that they were, remember, this is a company which had grown exponentially. So it was very young and very big, and then stumbled, either through sins of omission or commission, into huge, all-engulfing controversies. Cambridge Analytica, which of course we remember particularly in this country because it was ostensibly a British academic who illicitly took this Facebook data and gave it to that consultancy. The Russian interference via a Facebook app in the 2016 election. And I think they felt that they were an engineering company. Mark Zuckerberg is an engineer. He's not a politician. That they were in need of some kind of input, guidance, support, help from people from politics. And they particularly felt, rightly at the time, I think things have changed in ways which are quite interesting to reflect upon, that at the time they felt that a lot of the early kind of guardrails and parameters and regulatory initiatives would emanate from Europe. So they particularly wanted someone who had senior government experience and someone who had a sort of insight into Europe. So of course I ticked those boxes. And back to your earlier point, at the same time, my interest had been piqued by this growing backlash against these big tech companies by my time in government. I had endless running battles with the Home Office. I remember with Theresa May when she was Home Secretary. You may remember I vetoed for several years what eventually became dubbed the Snoopers Charter, which they shoved onto the statute book the moment the ungrateful voters of the country elbowed me aside in 2015. And so I'd become quite interested in, and I'd engaged a lot with these big tech companies as I was trying to understand the intense fear of the sort of security establishment in the UK about things like the advent of encryption and how are they going to surveil people. This is an establishment which is used to steaming open letters and listening to phone calls, and suddenly they're having to deal with these great big companies that had at that time at least a very sort of libertarian aversion to dealing with governments. So I'd become quite interested in that. I'd set up, after I lost my seat, after I left government, a little think tank called Open Reason, and I'd sort of published a few things about this whole thing of how do you bridge this gap of incomprehension between the political world and the tech world, because I could just see they were just talking past each other. So anyway, all of those things converged, and then Miriam and I talked about it endlessly, and actually, again, serendipity would have it that our oldest son had been very ill. A year or two early, he'd had cancer, and we'd taken him on a celebratory holiday, all of the boys, to California after his chemo had finished. So, of course, if you say to three boys, do you want to go and live and work in the place where we just went to Universal Studios on that fun park? They go, yeah! So anyway, it all, and we were just, Miriam and I were just sitting there just yelling at the television screen in fury about Brexit. So it worked for the family, it worked intellectually. So I was very, very lucky. I also wrote, I remember, a long email to Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg, and I genuinely thought when they read this, they're going to run a mile. And I said, I think you've made a whole bunch of mistakes here. I think these are mistakes that you've got to own. These are mistakes which you're having unfairly foisted upon you. Here's a whole bunch of changes I would make. And I'm not really interested in continuing this conversation unless you're really open to making them. And they, either out of desperation or foolishness, they were very receptive, much more receptive than I'd expected. So there you go. That's the background to it, and that's how I'm sure everybody in this room. You go through these funny coincidences in life where suddenly a decision makes sense that you just didn't expect.
Did you worry at all? As you say, a lot of people responded very negatively. As you say, Facebook, as it then was in the headlines for many of the wrong reasons. Did you worry that you were simply a piece of window dressing for them? So you sent them this long list of the things that you wanted to do. But you will have been aware, although I know you haven't read Sarah Wynne Williams' book about her experiences, she described them, disputed by Meta, about working in Meta, left before you arrived. And forgive my language here, but I'm just going to use one quote from it. These people didn't give a fuck. And the idea was that Facebook always lived by the mantra, move fast and break things.
Yeah.
Build it, and then if people come after us after, okay, we'll try and sort it out. I'm not saying that they were malicious or nasty, but it was all about scale and market dominance.
Yeah.
And if you could get lovely people, but like Nick Clegg, to come in and be the sort of face, and we used to see each other at Davos, didn't we? And you be able to give the sort of the messages that maybe Mark needed to send, or you yourself were sending with the oversight board and all the things you did put in place. Was it window dressing?
Well, obviously I don't think so at all, and I genuinely wouldn't have taken the job if that's what it was, and for a bunch of reasons. Firstly, they were desperate enough. I mean that. I remember saying to them, I think you are very soon going to just run out of societal permission to exist. You're either going to get broken up or regulate. Pick your poison. You cannot carry on stumbling from one headline-grabbing controversy to the next, day after day after day. And I just think they, just as sort of business people, they realize you can't. Look, social media is never going to be more than a heartbeat away from controversy, because you're dealing in the most liquid and controversial thing that exists, which is human speech. Because human speech is both beautiful and despicable, and human beings say and express themselves in good and bad and ugly forms, and all of that flows across these platforms. So you're never going to be free of controversy, but I think they knew, and certainly that was my assertion. I said, you are really within, it's 59 minutes to midnight if you want to carry on being able to innovate as a major tech company. So I think that was part of the reason. But also, honestly, I won't bore you with the internal mechanics of a company like that, but it was obvious to me that I would have oversight of and be in charge of a whole swathe of immensely substantive things, from the community standards which determine what is and what is not allowed on Facebook, and all of our interactions with governments. And I ended up obviously having to be the lead decision makers on highly consequential things, like whether to suspend Donald Trump from Facebook or not. That wasn't window dressing. So I was totally content right from the outset that it was a very substantive job. So no, I think for all of the... But look, they're not the RSPCA. I mean, it is a business. It's a business, and it's a very aggressive business in a very aggressively competitive environment. They're not angels. You shouldn't pretend that they're angels. They're not philosopher kings. They are hard-driving, engineers, hard-driving business people who want to beat their competitor. Mark is an incredibly competitive individual. So I don't want to sort of sugarcoat it either. But I kind of. Sort of that didn't surprise me. I mean, I wasn't working for an NGO. I was working for a business, and it's a business that makes a huge amount of money. Clearly made a whole bunch of mistakes. I think understood that it needed to very significantly course correct in order to sort of basically steady the ship and continue to operate. And I was at that particular time very keen to play the role in kind of ship steadier in chief, if I can put it. And that involved a whole bunch of changes to the product, to the way we took decisions, to people, to teams, to governance, and you name it. Now the company's going to a completely different chapter all over again, which we can come to, but it's obviously now quite different. But back in the late 2018, that was the challenge. And yeah, sure, people, but look, you've got to understand, I came from an environment where I was like being yelled at by critics, left, right and centre, every minute of the day. That's what I'd lived. So I just thought to myself, am I going to not do something as exciting and interesting as that? If challenging, if, yes, controversial, because someone's going to yell at me in a newspaper or something? It didn't really occur to me that would be the basis upon which I would take the decision.
Let's just go into that Donald Trump issue, because obviously it raises one of the most significant debates about the role of particularly social media, parts of what Meta does, which obviously is the part that we mostly use, although obviously Meta does other things as well. It was reported at the time that actually you were one of the driving forces behind Donald Trump being removed from the site. Is that right? And how do you now view, you talked about the pivot that Mark Zuckerberg has been through, how do you now view this battle between what might be described as, the community standards, that there needs to be controls on social media platforms versus the freedom of expression argument, which Mark has now pivoted much more strongly towards under Trump? Yeah, so... Just on the Trump thing first, and what happened. Take us in the room in that, that decision sort of cycle.
I'm so bad at remembering things minute by minute. But I think in a nutshell, after the 2020 election, you obviously had this extraordinary spectacle of an insurrection in the Capitol in DC, clearly seeking to arrest the democratic process and to stop the transfer of power from one outgoing president to another. And then Donald Trump posted various things. What he generally did actually at the time was not post first on Facebook. He would post on Twitter and then basically just copy and paste it onto Facebook. And the decision I had to take, in one of my roles, as I said earlier, was to oversee for those of you who don't know the jargon, I'm sure each of these big platforms have different labels for it. Meta has had something called the community standards. I think they are 20 to 21 categories of content that the company says it doesn't want on the platform, so it'll remove it, or it might demote it. And so it ranges from IP fraud to forms of bullying and harassment, and obviously to incitement to violence. And so it was my job to adjudicate on whether what he had said at that very heated time, whether that violated those community standards. And I felt it did, and took the decision and made the call that for that reason, extreme though it was, an extreme sanction though it was, he should be suspended from using the company services. I remember at the time thinking that it was just really important that these community standards shouldn't be applied selectively. They should be applied, without any fear or favour. However, whether you're a pope or a pauper, it was really important that if you violate those standards, they should be applied. That doesn't mean I didn't feel very, very kind of queasy about it, because quite as an old-fashioned liberal, I kind of think it's a big deal when a private sector company intrudes in the kind of public and political realm as much as that. But I equally felt, and that's the argument which won out in my own mind, was, well, hang on a minute, you don't need to, you can use other services, but if you're going to use Facebook services, you've got to play by the rules as they existed then. Fast forward now to your sort of linked question, it's completely changed, because in the intervening years, and this was dramatically accelerated by the events of the COVID pandemic and a perception on the right in the US that the Biden administration tried to censor US big tech in terms of censoring content around vaccines and the pandemic, and then a whole bunch of other things to do with the treatment of the content around the Hunter Biden laptop. I know, I won't bore you. There's a whole thing, a bunch, and then there was the George Floyd thing, a whole thing, bunch of things congealed, this great backlash against what was deemed to be sort of excessive wokery at the time in the US. All of these things congealed to create this extraordinarily powerful backlash against what Trump and Vance and others would say is a sort of over-censorious, a sort of uber-progressive approach to speech, where any form of kind of harm or insult is expunged from the internet by these big tech companies in their telling of it at the behest of Democrats when they were in power and so on and so forth. Of course, I was caught in the middle of all of that. I was the one, by the way, in the pandemic. Cut me off when this starts getting uninteresting. Who would get called by the White House during the COVID pandemic, but by very senior officials saying, "Why is that on Facebook? Why is that on? That's going to discourage people from taking the vaccine." I remember having a blazy argument in the middle of the night with Biden's sort of senior COVID person who wanted me to remove, or instruct the teams to remove a piece of satirical content. I remember it had a meme with Leonardo DiCaprio in front of a television. I can't remember what it was about again. And I remember saying to him, "You've got to be kidding. We're not having to start sort of removing satire. What's going to be left on the internet?" And so, anyway, it's all by way of illustration that this debate, I think we just don't appreciate on this side of the Atlantic how much the fundamental tenets of speech, and where does free speech end and content moderation begin, has become so insanely politicized in the US. And so, and then of course the real capstone to it all was Elon Musk taking over Twitter, this very libertarian thing. Do you remember he walked into the building with a blue bowl, I think it was. What was the point of that again?
I can't
remember. What was it? The sink. Yeah, but what was the anyway, never mind. There was some laboured witticism related to it. But anyway, and that really moved the whole zeitgeist in Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley had traditionally been a pretty squidgy centre-left place.
Isn't this the problem, though? Or is it a problem? So, as you say, Facebook isn't the RSPCA. It's far more powerful than that. And I remember having lunch with Vince Cerf and a couple of other senior journalists, and Vince said that he was asked the stupidest and the cleverest question in that lunch, and I'll spare the blushes of who asked the questions, because he asked the same, both of them. One was, will the internet ever fill up? And Vince assured him that that's not quite how technology works. But the second one was, it's all very well for Mark Zuckerberg or Nick Clegg or Sundar Pichai or whoever it might be to say, under my watch, these things won't happen. But what happens when a new owner comes in and says, actually, forget all that, we're going to do something completely different? Either a different person, Elon Musk at X, or Mark Zuckerberg pivoting to getting rid of community standards, bringing in the Wikipedia-style controls by the audience or the community, and not even going to the oversight board, which you would put in place, to go through a policy process and say, is this the right thing that we should be doing? So the problem is that many people would say, you pick apart in your book to a degree, is that the power vested in tech firms is so huge, and can pivot from year to year so that we don't know, as their audiences and as democratic societies, what's going to happen next. The fact of what has happened with X, doesn't that slightly undermine, you're not optimistic, but you say that there are so many positives that have come from the social media explosion, but doesn't it slightly undermine your more liberal attitude, given what has happened to X as a platform?
Yes. So what I call in the book the power paradox is very real. And what I mean by that is I think these technologies, by and large, and certainly social media of old, I'll come to that in a minute, because I think social media has actually mutated almost beyond recognition, literally in the last year or two, which I'll come back to in a minute. But the social media that I knew and understood when I arrived in Silicon Valley in late 2018, I think is very empowering, because it gives billions of people around the world for free, because it's paid for by advertising, the ability to express themselves, share content, join groups, get involved in debates. I mean, it's an extraordinarily empowering tool. It's actually very democratizing in the following. I mean, a poor farmer in Guatemala can use Instagram just as much as a fancy banker in Wall Street. A huge number, particularly of small, medium-sized businesses, have flourished on these platforms as well, because it's a very cheap way of trying to reach customers and so on. Yet at the same time, whilst it's very sort of individually empowering and disperses power like that, it aggregates and concentrates vast amounts of power in the hands of a tiny number of people. And in Meta's case, in the hands of a 42-year-old who still controls the company, as one individual. So you've got this really weird irony of great dispersal of power and great over-concentration of power all at the same time. And I think that's a very, very unstable thing. And I think it's particularly unstable when things happen in exactly the way that you describe, when changes seem to be sort of driven by the personal whim and wishes of those leaders, which is why when I was at that company, I always advocated against it. Because I said, it'll always eventually go horribly wrong if people think this is basically something driven by the shifting whims and wishes of one individual engineer in Silicon Valley. It's what I always felt, that whether it's the oversight board, whether it's the kind of transparency that I built into how these community standards operated, whether it was cooperating more with researchers, sharing more data, getting more academics in to actually look into it, being much more transparent with users about what controls they have over their experience, etc., was so important, because I fundamentally agree with you. I think if these very powerful technologies are seen to be nothing more than playthings, capricious playthings for unelected individuals, eventually society will not accept that. And I think that is, and I describe this in the really excellent and very readable book, which is available at all bookstores soon. I think all of that is going to be accelerated by generative AI. So that power paradox of dispersal of power and over-concentration of power, you're going to have that with knobs on with AI, partly because the physics of AI, at least how you create these training, what they call foundation models in the first place, is incredibly centralizing itself, because it's so expensive. You need so much money, data, compute capacity, energy, water, and so on. So only a very few number of entities can literally just physically build this stuff. So you've got this really weird bifurcation between dispersed and concentrated power, and that I think is going to become so much more extreme now, because only an even smaller handful of people are actually going to be able to build this stuff in the first place, and then we're all going to feel empowered by having our own sort of personalized agentic AIs who will remind us when it's our mum's birthday or how to book our holiday and so on. So I describe in the book how, and my view, in the long run, that won't work for these tech companies. I may be wrong. Maybe they'll lord it all over us from, the gleaming towers of China and West Coast. I think eventually that just becomes societally unacceptable, much, by the way, like the railway barons, just their power when they built the infrastructure of the modern world, from coast to coast in the United States, that just became eventually unacceptable, just too much power. I wouldn't be surprised if over time, particularly this vast investment in this layer, this sort of foundational layer of the AI revolution, these data centers and so on, eventually become either nationalized or regulated, which is why, as I explain in that outstanding book that you so kindly keep pointing to, that it is in the long-term interests of those companies themselves to be a whole lot more transparent and a whole lot more open.